Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. It's the latest in a series of our occasional webinars brought to you by Tan Legal with the assistance of Landmark Chambers. Today's session is all about the latest and biggest news by far in the planning world, namely the LERB, but we're going to be looking at it through a particular lens so as to ask and hopefully generate some answers as to whether the bill will deliver more housing or not. As many commentators have said, isn't it a bill about housing after all? So to help examine the LERB with that question in mind, today we have obviously a most learned panel, so let me introduce them to you. Delighted that we're joined by Kathryn Ventham, Planning Director at Barton Willmore, now Stantec. Kathryn works across all types of development, but specialises in mixed use and residential schemes, so she's ideally placed to help us with today's question. Hello, Kathryn.
Hello, thank you very much for the invite.
And moving on to Zack Simons from Landmark, who needs no introduction, I'm sure, a familiar face from many of our previous webinars and also from his excellent PlannerAx blog. Hi, Zack.
Meeta, hello.
Hello. And last, in terms of the main panel, but obviously far from least, Simon Ricketts, my brilliant fellow partner at Tan Legal. Say hello, Simon. Oh.
Thank you. Hello. Hello.
Great. So that's the panel. But just when you thought it couldn't get any better, we also have a very special guest. We're very lucky to be joined by Simon Gallagher, Director of Planning at the Department for Levelling-up Housing and Communities. Thanks for joining us, Simon. I know you're obviously very busy at the moment, well, probably always very busy, but particularly busy at the moment with the LERB. Hopefully you are going to be able to stay until the end and give us the response, give us your response to the question. Without wishing to steal your thunder, just taking a wild stab in the dark, I'm guessing your answer is yes. But we're obviously all really, really keen to hear why your answer is yes. Hello, Simon.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Before we go any further, though, a few housekeeping points to note. Your microphones are all automatically muted, so you don't need to adjust any of your own settings. We won't be having an open Q&A session in this webinar because there's quite a lot to get through. So unfortunately, there simply isn't time. If you lose your connection at any point in the webinar, you can just rejoin the meeting by clicking on your original link. So time to get on with the session. We have an hour, so as is customary, I'm going to tell you what we're going to say, then we're going to say it, and then we'll probably summarise what we've just said at the end, possibly with a few questions thrown in. So what are we going to say? Kathryn is going to cover the implications of the plan-making aspects of the bill on housing delivery and housing numbers. Zack is going to cover the implications of the new presumption in favour of the plan. Simon R is going to cover national development management policies, local design codes, amendments to planning commissions, and sort of various other parts of the bill that are more self-contained, but also focused on sort of practical delivery issues like commencement and completion notices. And then finally, I'm going to spend a few minutes on our favourite subject, which is of course development tax in the form of the new infrastructure levy. And we have Simon G here. Simon, you're going to chime in on each of these issues as we go through them. And if there is some time at the end, then we've got a few general overarching questions for you as to sort of next steps and that sort of thing. So on that basis, I think we better get going to the actual meat of this webinar. Kathryn, can I hand over to you to kick us off?
You can indeed. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that when it comes to this topic, probably you'll be more interested to hear Simon G's view than mine. So I will inevitably make sure I leave sufficient time for Simon to talk about it as well. I was given the topic, or looked at the topic of housing numbers and local plans. And obviously the first point on this is probably that the housing numbers is a notable omission from the bill. We've obviously looked previously, or looked in the recent past in respect of amendments to the standard method, and obviously that doesn't feature in the bill, although it obviously is a critical component when we look to other items in the bill in terms of speeding up the local plan process. Simon may well tell me otherwise, but I would assume that having attempted revisions to the standard method and generating phrases such as mutant algorithms, that given the incumbent government's current position, they may well have took the view that including that within the bill may actually hinder rather than help the progress of the bill. But actually, Simon, just bringing you in a little bit earlier than I thought, but is there a sort of specific reason why the housing numbers has been omitted from the bill?
So traditionally we do housing policies and planning content in the National Planning Policy Framework and supporting guidance rather than in primary legislation. One of the weirdnesses of planning coming into it from other areas has been that the primary legislation principally deals with the process and the arrangements for things, and the what and the content tends to be handled through national planning policy. So that is a long-standing framework which we're not disturbing through the bill.
Okay, thanks. Can I just then ask, can we expect something more on that, do you think, then?
Well, what we've said is that we will publish a prospectus for a new national planning policy framework this spring alongside the bill, so people can see what we're meaning on some of the key issues, and one or two of which we will come on to in the context of this conversation. But I think one of the things we will need to do after the bill goes through is then turn that into a full new national planning policy framework.
Okay, thanks. So just then taking a look at plan making, I think the first thing to note is that obviously on face value, it appears to look at a sort of local level, but I think in reality, what has emerged from a sort of more continued read of the bill, I'd say, is possibly a greater deference to the national level. And Simon, you've just referenced the refocus of the NPPF as well. At the national level, we have got a national development management policy coming, which is going to set out national level policies. I'm not going to talk too much on that because Simon Ricketts is going to come on and talk to you about that in a minute. But my reading of the bill is that effectively what that's aimed at doing is linking into this wider rhetoric about speeding up the local plan process, feeding into the timescales which are now envisaged in the bill of a clear timescale for plan production. We're looking at a timescale of 30 months, and one assumes that the logic behind that is that if we strip out the high level policies and don't replicate these in the plan, that might assist in speeding that up. The question that I would have on that, Simon, from my perspective, is that I do a lot of local plan examination work, and I don't spend a huge amount of time talking about those policies. I spend a huge amount of time talking about the policies which are now sort of dealt with in the local plan, which is the sort of local level policies which are now going to be the remit of the plan. So just from your perspective, how do you envisage that stripping out the higher level policies, other than obviously making the plan slimmer, how do you envisage that would then speed up the process?
Well, look, Kathryn, I'll probably have to go into some other aspects because it's not going to be, that is not the only element that is designed to speed up and simplify plan production. But let me go back 2 stages to get further forward, if I can do, and partly in an attempt to sort of answer the question Meeta set us at the start about whether the bill delivers more homes. The first bit I wanted to say was that you should regard it as important that the bill's title is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, not the Planning for Housing Numbers Bill or any other form of numbers. Those are the key topics that my Secretary of State wanted reflected in it. It's about levelling up and regeneration, and those are the measures there. And what the bill is largely about is creating a toolkit of things which local leaders can use to regenerate their communities. And so there's some really important changes on compulsory purchase, on which we published a further consultation today to exploring some of those, which could be some more tools for regeneration around high street rental auctions, around new powers for development corporations. And so those, I think, are the core of where we see the sort of the development and the regeneration coming through. I guess the other bit, though, and then just to sort of come back towards your question, Kathryn, which I think is a great one, is that what we are seeing is the decline over recent years of plan making. We've seen it for a lot of reasons being really hard for a lot of communities to get a plan in place. And plan coverage stands up, it's hard to make a precise estimate because some plans are maybe old, but some of the policies are up to date. But broadly, only 40% of the country is covered by an up-to-date local plan, which means in the remaining areas, planning is either by application, which gives very little certainty for either the investors or the community, or by appeal, where there is even less certainty, and there's probably some greater consternation in the communities. And so what this bill is about giving a real serious go at getting plan making in there. You know, what our vision, and this is where I really do get to answering your question eventually, Kathryn, is what if we could strip plans right back to the essentials of what a plan should do, about where they map an area, show what's possible and what's not possible in different places, overlay the policies on them. What if we use the power of new tech to make those much more interactive documents? Could that make something that is vastly more accessible, more interesting to communities, and be simpler for everybody to engage with, and therefore help focus the discussion onto exactly those precise questions that you described, Kathryn, which are inevitably right at the heart of plan making. If we can, we've seen too much of local plans which have become 500-page PDF files in there, which for a small investor or even a consultant or lawyer with an expertise in looking at these, it's pretty hard to find out what is actually possible in which places. Can we get something which strips it back to the core, is what we're trying to do, rather than get, sort of tolerate this expansion of plans, and thereby reduce the cost and increase the benefits for communities for getting a plan in place. And one of the key things we've done we're proposing is to get rid of the 5-year land supply test for the first 5 years of a plan. So there's a real active benefit for the local community in getting a plan in place. And I think that what we're trying to do is a few sort of tweaks that increase the incentives to do there, and a bit more of the consequences if you don't get plans in place. And that, I theory, should just nudge this so that we're getting more plans in place, and so that the relative to a counterfactual which sees this decline in plan making, we think we should be adding more plans, and we know more plans means sort of homes that that communities buy into.
Thanks, and I think from my perspective, I'd say I don't know many planning practitioners who wouldn't support a more plan-led system, really. I think, and I was quite encouraged by the use of your word visionary then, and I really hope that by stripping back the planning system, we might get something which is a little bit more visionary. Because from personal experience, I would say what I tend to find is that plans can often read as a little bit defensive and a little bit about control rather than sort of growth and embracing opportunities, really. So if that's what comes out of it, then I would say, okay, that's a good thing, really. In terms of just in terms of obviously a couple of those sort of big ticket items on there, obviously removal of duty to cooperate, and what that is replaced with, what actually a sort of flexible alignment test, what that actually means in practice. And you actually sort of used the phrase there, I think you were talking about a few tweaks to sort of incentivize plan production. I think one of the concerns that I think a few people have had, including myself, is that yes, we can see the incentives, but actually sometimes you need the sort of the sticks as well to kind of push these things along, because for some authorities, for example, getting rid of a 5-year housing land supply, well, if you're primarily greenbelt, doesn't really make the 5-year housing land supply, it bears little sort of impact on you, really. So it's kind of just, I don't know any people who would say that duty to cooperate probably needs a revamp in some form, but on the plus side, it does flush out some of the cooperation points into a public arena quite early on, and it's kind of understanding what a flexible alignment test might, or how that might manifest itself, and actually what effect that will have, really.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question. It links actually back to your first point about the connections between the wonderful worlds of policy and law. At the moment, the duty to cooperate being a statutory test, it's only a pass-fail. And it's really hard for local authorities who get into a problem on duty to cooperate matters at examination to fix it. Now, what we're proposing to do is take that out of law, and the bill has the effect of doing so. Incidentally, one of the things I got bogged down with was couldn't find where it had been repealed, and spent ages trying to hunt that down. It does do it. It does work. I've gone through it, but it took me about 2 days to find my way through that. But to put some kind of more policy test in there, which would enable it to be more like the other tests of soundness, of how it fits in and aligns with neighbouring areas where there are plans. I think this is one of the things that we're going to have to put out some thoughts on as part of what I've described as our prospectus. Over the next couple of months. I think there's lots of ideas for how we can do this. I think the key thing is it needs to be a bit more flexible so that it can be fixed in examination, whereas what we're finding at the moment is that planning inspectors, if you fail the duty to cooperate, your options are only to withdraw the plan or not, whereas if we can get something which is a bit more judgment based, there's a bit more fixed, a bit more focused on key things like, if somebody is building a new settlement right next to one local authority's boundary, which is dependent critically on a bit of infrastructure that stretches over the other one, and that isn't provided for in the neighbouring plan, then clearly you've got a bit of an alignment issue.
Yeah.
But how far we go, one for development, I think.
Okay, thanks. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'll hand over to Zack in a moment. But just a couple of other sort of very quick thoughts, I think, from my perspective. The idea of gateway provisions, I think, is a good thing. I think the earlier you can get advice, and if it's good advice, then obviously that's never a bad thing. Local plan commissioners, again, I guess it's how that's used and when that's used, and actually the impact that might have. A really boring planning geeky one, but I did see about a consolidated proposals map. That would be really helpful, thank you. And if you can print extracts of it or save extracts, that would be even better. But I think, probably coming to the question, and I appreciate you might address this question sort of towards the end, Simon, but I think the question, from my perspective about, will it deliver more housing? I'd love to say yes, and I really don't. And I don't underestimate the task, or of those whose job it is to produce this. I think I do have some concerns about the extent to which it will speed up plan making. I fully support plan making as a process, but I really do. I have some concerns, from my perspective, and that might come out in the wash in terms of when more detail comes out, or it might come out when we get the new version of the MPPF. I'm just slightly worried as to kind of how the housing number fits into it. And then actually how we do go about speeding up the system, and probably the really difficult ones, is obviously the any political intervention, and I'm sure Simon Ricketts will talk about this when we come on to the sort of national side of it. But how to deal with that when we've got a general election coming up in a couple of years again, and the sort of intertwining really of politics and planning. So I'd love to say yes. It probably requires a bit more kind of detail to come out before I can be a bit more positive, unfortunately.
Well, that's fair, and I wouldn't expect you to say anything other. The thing I'd say is that as a good sort of policy making, you've got to beat your counterfactual, and that's why I think it is important. Too much of the problem with planning is comparing things to how it was in a year or at a particular point of time. Does it be improved relative to the counterfactual? And I think there's something there, and I think there is certainly something for the plan making system as a least worst of all possible ways of doing this, because I think planning by application has real costs to smaller developers. Planning by contested appeal has real costs for communities. So I think it behooves all of us involved in planning to have a go at seeing whether we can come up with a simpler and better way of planning. And one of the virtues of what we've done with the bill of creating quite much a framework is to sort of say, instead of let's do this as questions of me, well, how are we all going to get in as professionals involved in this world in designing something which actually does work and does do some of this, and which actually helps our the poor local authority and political and official staff to work through this. So I think that's the task for us for the next phase.
Thanks. Meeta, can I think probably dealt with my section now, if I hand over to, I think it's Zack who's next.
Thanks, Kathryn, and Simon. Thanks. That was really good discussion to kick us off. And thanks, Kathryn. Really, incisive, and really sort of got us off to a good start in terms of the main issues in that subject area. Before I do hand over to Zack, Simon G, I know you've had an opportunity there to talk about the plan making side of things. Were there any other general overarching comments that you wanted to make before we move on?
I think I've made them in the course of that by not answering Kathryn's question very well at the outset and by going backwards. I've been well trained by my bosses.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Simon. In that case, Zack, time to hand over to you to give us some thoughts on the implications of the new presumption in favour of the plan and what implications that might have for housing delivery.
Thank you, Meeta. Well, it follows on very neatly from that, the answers that Simon was just giving, really, because we all know, or we think we know anyway, that we're working in a system which is plan-led, quote unquote. In fact, the current version of the NPPF tells us that our system is not only a little bit plan-led, it is genuinely plan-led, is the word that's used. So, you know, that sounds important. But what does plan-led actually mean? It sounds simple enough. You make a plan, you follow the plan, but of course there's a bit more to it than that. And to understand why the change that's proposed in LERB matters, I think we need to understand the current state of the law, if you like, and what it does and doesn't say. All the way back, very briefly, but all the way back to the 1947 Act, which passed under Clem Attlee's government, created the basic building blocks for the modern planning system, and told us in section 14 of that act that in dealing with any planning applications, the authorities shall have regard to the provisions of the plan so far as material thereto. We don't get enough drafting like that anymore, Simon. So far as material thereto and any other material considerations. And as we know, that clause, in a slightly modernised form, but anyway, the substance of that clause has gone the distance, and we get the same thing in section 70 of the current Act, the 1990 Act, which tells us that authorities have to have regard to the provisions of the development plan so far as material, and to lots of other things too, including other material considerations. So the key thing about those absolutely foundational provisions for our planning system, which have been around as long as we've had a planning system, is that they make it necessary to consider the plan. But they do not give any legal primacy to doing what the plan says. Section 70 of the 1990 Act doesn't say follow where the plan leads. It just says you've got to think about the plan. And you've also got to think about a number of other things too. You've got to reach a balance. That's step one. Step two is section 26 of the Planning and Compensation Act 1991, which starts, if you like, to tilt the balance in favour of the plan. This is where we get what you might call a plan-led system, which turns into a presumption in favour of the plan. You should follow where the plan leads in a nutshell, unless there's a good reason not to. And the language is where, in making any determination under the Planning Act's regard is to be had to the plan, the determination should be made in accordance with the plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. That's a big step over and above section 70 of the 1990 Act. And that legal presumption in favour of the plan, as we know, has been the bedrock of development management in England for over 30 years, and it's made its way into section 38(6) of the 2004 Act, which is the section that those of us engaged in this sort of job are dealing with day in, day out. So that's the law. What does it actually mean? Loads of cases over 30 years have considered that language. The classic text probably remains the House of Lords decision on the Scottish equivalent of those provisions in the Edinburgh City Council case in 1997. And from that case and the legions of others that have followed it, the courts have distilled a few key principles about this section 38(6) duty. The effect of section 38(6) is to give priority to the plan, so it creates a presumption in favour of the plan. And to follow that presumption, normally decision makers need to decide whether or not an application or an appeal scheme accords with the plan read as a whole. Doesn't mean adhering to every single policy in a plan. Policies may pull in different directions, the courts have told us. But in any event, there's a presumption, but presumptions can be rebutted. The courts have told us that, of course, you know, plans become outdated. They might become superseded by more recent guidance, national policy or whatever, which means that Lord Clyde said way back in the Edinburgh case, this presumption is not a mechanical preference for the plan. There remains a valuable element of flexibility. Or as Lord Hope put it in that Edinburgh case, the plan doesn't have absolute authority. The LPA need not slavishly adhere to it, is the phrase he used. And in the end, this decision on where the balance lies between the plan and other material considerations, how much weight to give all of these ingredients in the balance, is a question of judgment for the decision maker. It's not prescribed by the statute or anywhere else. So albeit we start with the plan under section 38(6), it's no part of the law at the moment that you have to give the plan more weight than anything else, other considerations in the balance. All of that's a question of judgment for decision makers, and that's telling you what you all already know. But that's the law that we have today. So what does LERB do about this? Well, for England, the proposal is to insert a new section 38.5a and 5b, 5c. All of that will replace section 38.6 for English applications. And under this balance, decisions must be made in accordance with the development plan and any national development management policies. See Simon Ricketts' talk in a few minutes' time, unless material considerations strongly indicate otherwise. And also, if to any extent the development plan conflicts with the national development management policy, you resolve the conflict in favour of the national policy. Now, that changes the law, I think, or proposes to change the law in at least two really significant ways. Firstly, now we'd have the core requirement is to take the determination in accordance with national policy first, or national DM policy first, and then after that, so long as there's no conflict with national policy, the development plan. And as I say, Simon Ricketts is going to comment on those national development management policies in a mo, so I won't go into what they might comprise. But what we should note is for all these years, documents like the NPPF and its many predecessors have, at least in theory, been subsidiary to the statutory development plan. They aren't in charge in a plan-led world, even though slightly oddly, they purport to be able to render development plans out of date. But that legal relationship would change under the bill. National policies actually come first, or those which are designated as national DM policies. Now, much will depend on what those policies say, obviously, but it seems to me that creates the legal infrastructure for a pretty significant shift away from, not towards a system that you might describe as plan-led, at least if by plan-led you mean locally plan-led, because of this extra layer of national policies. But I think that this is a shift that, depending on what the policies the Secretary of State decides to make national DM policies, TBD, it could be a real vehicle to deliver more housing. More on that in a couple of minutes. And second, the other really important proposed change in the law is that for material considerations to indicate taking a decision other than that which accords with the plan, they'd have to strongly indicate taking a decision otherwise than that which the plan would indicate strongly. And this is the strengthened emphasis on the plan-led approach that was promised actually back in the 2020 white paper. We all know the problem, I think. In my own practice, so many of my appeal cases involve refusals of planning permission against officers' advice on allocated sites. When councils have spent so much time and money producing a plan in the first place, seeing its provisions flouted can be frustrating, it can be expensive, and many of my clients throw their hands up in despair. So often the implication is, at least to cynics out there, that our system can be led as much by local politics as local plans. So will that word strongly make a difference? Will it, on our topic of today, lead to more houses being built? I think at the local level, well, I'm sorry to say this, as Kathryn does, I would very much like to see a plan making system delivering lots more homes. My sense is at the local level, just focusing on 38.5 and the proposed changes, we're unlikely to see much of a difference. We already have a presumption in favour of the plan. Adding an adverb like strongly to that presumption is, in my own just personal view, it's unlikely to make much of a difference when it comes to winning the hearts and minds of local councillors for schemes which may, for whatever reason, be difficult or unpopular. And in the end, inevitably, the courts will tell us that striking the balance between the plan and other material considerations is a planning judgment exercise, whether that word strongly is there or not. And so I don't see much sort of legal ammunition to persuade decision makers to do the right thing. I do see that on appeal, inspectors would, you would hope, focus in on the wording of that test and apply it properly. But in my experience, they're already giving more than enough weight to development plans when those plans are recently adopted and up to date. The really thorny issues on weighing development plan policies on appeal tend to come when plans are out of date. As Simon said, that's quite a common occurrence around the country. But in those circumstances, the strength built into this new presumption will start to recede anyway. But most fundamentally, a presumption in favour of the development plan only works if councils can be persuaded, incentivised, as Kathryn and Simon were just talking about, regularly to adopt up-to-date plans, and further to that, can be persuaded to undertake the strategic spatial planning with neighbours, which is currently only optional, not mandatory in the bill, but could, I think, be an engine of really important growth. It treads slightly outside the remit of my talk. It goes back to what Kathryn was just talking about with Simon, but I think the real answer to the question is that more houses requires councils to adopt more plans. Essentially, it's simplistic, but I think, you know, fair enough. So the real test against which those like me, who work in my world, will be judging LURB and its proposals is whether it shifts the ground enough to get those plans pushed through in order to reverse what Simon referred to as a decline in decision making, in plan making. And that's all I wanted to say in my 10-minute spiel. But Simon, I think I'm to pass to you now to see whether or not there's anything you'd like to say by way of commenting on what I've said.
Zach, I'd never dare dispute your legal explanations there. I think you've captured the issues very well. So I think the bit I just want to do, and Zach, you hinted at this, but let me just do a bit more on this, is the history and where we came from. The 2020 white paper really proposed that the plan was absolutely binding. So the idea there was you would fix land categorizations, and those land uses would be fixed in the plan and you could not depart from them. And we heard quite a lot of powerful representations on many topics in response to that white paper, but one of which was that you need a little bit more flexibility in the system. And what we've been trying to do is balance that need for a bit of flexibility, because stuff happens, with the sort of, yeah, but actually there was a reason why we were interested in giving more weight to plans, which is the certainty that that gives to investors, to and particularly to smaller developers, is really important. So this is a way we think we can dial up the certainty, working within the existing framework that, as you have described it. You know, there is a bit of a question about the weight of an adverb, and I predict there will be a degree of interest in that. But equally, one of the things we were keen to do is evolve the English planning system here and get something with a framework that we can get there. But one of the things that we have noticed is that for local politicians, you've got to show there's some real gain to them to getting a plan in place. And this confidence that decisions will be taken in line with that plan actually is one of the, by inspectors, is one of the things which dials up the expectations and the incentives on them. And I think it's quite material. I'm really pleased that you finished off by saying that one of the tests of this is whether we can get more plans in place, because I think that is sort of the game. You know, more plans than what? Whether is it more plans than the declining counterfactual that I portrayed at the start? I think yes, but how much further we can go is a real test, and there is a limited amount that we can achieve from government, but our job is to create the framework which enables the democratically elected councillors to take this forward within their own areas.
I think, Simon, that that's really interesting. If there was one sort of provision in the current MPPF that I think might sort of be the key to unlocking the door to, you know, for greater incentives to adopt plans, it tallies with something that Kathryn was saying earlier on. It's probably footnote 7, I think, into paragraph 11 of the current framework, which is the footnote that essentially is only a footnote, but of course a very, very important bit of policy that has the effect of disapplying what would otherwise be the consequences of failing to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply in areas where lots of particular environmental policies of protection pertain. And of course, there's very good reasons why you might want to do something like that. But as Kathryn said, I think the real risk that I think some of us see in lots of very well publicised authority areas, not just in the southeast, but there are lots of high-profile examples in the southeast, all metropolitan greenbelt authorities, is that for such authorities which are covered by, you know, in some cases 80–90% plus greenbelt, the policy you referred to earlier of reducing the need in the first 5 years of a new plan to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply doesn't have the teeth that it would otherwise have elsewhere. And so in such authority areas, and those are the ones which have really struggled, many of them have really struggled to take plans forward, one casts around for that we need other incentives, if you like, to get those authorities planning, or really for the local politicians to see the benefits, I suspect, of plan making in those areas. But I am definitely trespassing on things that Kathryn's already covered. So shut up now.
But you win bonus points for using the LERB acronym. I was disappointed. I tried to call this the Bill for Levelling Up and Regeneration Blur because I'd had a whole load of Britpop puns in there,
Absolutely.
but I've lost that one.
Well, it's a great segue to Simon Ricketts, I suspect, as puns on the name of the bill.
Brilliant. Thanks, Zack and Simon. Zack, I do love the fact that you had a timer on and that we got to hear it go off. Possibly also slightly relieved because when you started at the 1947 Act, I was wondering how many bits of legislation we were going to go through before we brought us up to date. A good history lesson in planning it would have been, but I think we've got some other things to cover. But now it is definitely over to Simon Ricketts. You're going to cover things like the National Development Management Policies and Design Codes and other practical, useful parts of the bill.
Yeah, no, thank you, Meeta. And no, there's no LERB puns, I'm afraid. And before I get into the, sorry to disappoint, before I get into the sort of the main development management aspects that I wanted to talk about, I wanted to step back, and it chimes very much with what we've been talking about so far, because the changes that are proposed to development management procedures are in my view, useful, but they're relatively limited. And the most important things that are going to have an impact are in two categories, to my mind. First of all, getting the changes to plan making right, because if your scheme isn't in the plan, if it isn't consistent with national development management policies and local design codes, we haven't talked about local design codes yet, you're really going to be pushing water uphill with your scheme. Whereas if you're consistent with the local plan, the national development management policies, local design codes, then you're going to have a much smoother ride. And I think that's really at the heart of all of this. But secondly, as ever, it's all about the money. And so it's all about, on one side of the coin, it's about scheme viability, preserving scheme viability, making sure the infrastructure levy works. And on the other side of the coin, it's about, the resources that are needed to make the system work. And higher application fees may help, but obviously they're not ring-fenced, as I understand. So I only wanted to touch on a few proposals within the bill in my few minutes. First of all, yes, this new definition of national development management policy that's introduced, it will be new section 8ZA of the 2004 Act. And it's really a policy which the Secretary of State designates as a national development management policy. So the usual sort of circular definition, which concerns the development or use of land in England. And we expect that the national development management policies will set out national policies on issues that apply in most local authorities and that you commonly see in all local authority plans, with variations on wording in terms of heritage protection, policies relating to the Greenbelt, etc. And it would be great to strip all of those out and have consistency. As we've heard, your DM policies at a national level will be given the same weight as development plans, so will need to be taken fully into account in decision making. To an extent, maybe a limited extent, as Kathryn alludes to, it will speed up local plan processes. It will certainly make local plans shorter. It will also enable a more consistent approach to policy interpretation, because we've all scratched our heads over endless permutations of these basically bog standard policies. But what I'm a bit uncertain about is where the dividing line is between development management policies that are going to be dealt with at a national level and those which really need to remain either at a local level or the London plan level, because I can see that it will be straightforward to have policy tests for heritage, flooding, greenbelt, various other environmental issues, which are basically replicating what's already in the NPPF by way of tests. But then when you look at your typical DM policies in a local plan, what about housing sizes, tenure types, you know, your policies on amalgamation and subdivision of dwellings, the approach to loss of housing to commercial uses, you know, how much outdoor space needs to be provided with housing, play space, etc. And what I see is there's probably going to be a dividing line between what goes in national development management policies and what goes in local design codes. And I think there could be a bit of a battleground here or a turf war, because, you know, a local authority or whoever is preparing a local design code probably wants to control a lot of that. So where the dividing line is, and where the government starts in terms of the consultation over the national policies, I think is going to be really important and interesting. The second thing I wanted to talk about was amendments to planning permission. I mean, given that planning application processes for large schemes are not going to be significantly shortened under the new system, it's important that there is a workable process for amending planning permissions. You know, we've currently got Section 96A, Section 73. It was interesting to me that Joanna Aveley in her newsletter last week to chief planners specifically warned of the need for amendment of many permissions due to the requirements of the new building regulations. And that's just an example of the fact that it's routine to need to keep permissions up to date and to be able to amend them. We've had clouds of uncertainty in recent years and additional complexity as a result of court rulings, the Finney case and the Hillside case. Now, it's really welcome that there's a provision in the bill which essentially deals with Finney, which said that you couldn't make a Section 73 application where what you're proposing amounts will necessitate an amendment to the description and development on the face of the permission. And there's going to be a new procedure which allows you to make non-substantial changes to a permission, including to the descriptor of development. It's going to be interesting to see how non-substantial changes is interpreted, but it does give some additional flexibility. I'd love to have seen the provisions go further, as Simon knows, and to tackle Hillside, but we're just going to have to cross our fingers when the Supreme Court considers that issue at the beginning of July. And the third and final thing I just wanted to touch on in my limited time was commencement notices are a new procedure in that the bill indicates or provides that developers will need to provide serve commencement notices on the local authority before starting development, and they will need to include information which will include not just the intended commencement date of development, but the proposed, can include the proposed delivery rate of the scheme in terms of, how many numbers of dwellings are going to come forward over each year, and the date on which other developments is expected to be substantially completed. And that's going to be, I can see very useful for many purposes, but when you put it together with provisions that make completion notices more straightforward for authorities to serve on owners without any approval process involving the Secretary of State, where the owner objects to the completion notice. I do think, dependent on what policy guidance comes through, we are moving more towards use it or lose it. When it comes to whether that will deliver more housing, it may well do, but I think it will bring differing influences into the planning process and cause some applicants perhaps to, question whether they should be bringing forward applications, within a particular timescale or whatever. I think there hasn't been as much commentary yet as I would have expected on the extent to which, these provisions add up to something which is really trying to move the dial in terms of encouraging not just issue of permission, but delivery. I think I'll end it there so that Simon can put me right on what I've said. But any thoughts, Simon?
I, again, wouldn't have the temerity to try and put you right on that. No, I think that's very good. I think on national development management policies, we understand that we have created the framework for these, and we need to set out in a bit more detail how these might work. There is a proper discussion to be had here about the boundaries of local freedoms and flexibilities and efficient and sensible central standardization. You know, there are some things, some of which were the ones you described, Simon, where, you know, what we see is a bit similar story to you, that there's a lot of time wasted at examination with sort of minute textual changes to policies to try and bring them into a line with a national policy. You know, let's not waste that bit of time. But how far that wants to go, I think that's a productive space for those on this sort of call to be started to think about where is the right space, what are the practical spaces we could do to draw the line. And then just to pick your point on the commencement and completion notices, I agree this hasn't had much attention. So there is a debate in our world about build out and slow build out of permissions, which, whether or not it's true in the real world, is a real issue for a lot of councillors. And I've listened to a lot of them discussing how much of a practical problem this is. If they want to sort of win popular support for development for the next period, they need to show that things are actually happening this period. And so this is designed to give them more tools to help to support support delivery in their areas. And I think it's a further reminder that we're trying to get here as planning to be a very much an active tool, not just a passive approach to sort of, well, permission and that's it. It's a positively shape the place, positively lead the regeneration, positively manage the development process, and they put a bit more of the control back into the council as place shapers in this process.
Great, thanks, Simon and Simon. I'm conscious of time. We don't seem to have very much time left. And I would imagine that there are probably a few people breathing a huge sigh of relief because our last topic is the infrastructure levy. So I'll do my best to get through the a bit of discussion on the infrastructure levy as quickly as possible, and hopefully we will still have a couple of minutes at the end to come back to some general questions to pose them to Simon in terms of the sort of next steps parts of this whole process. So final area that we're going to focus on, as I say, is the new infrastructure levy, so the IL, which is proposed to replace SIL in England. So if I just spend a few minutes covering what that looks like so far as we know to date, before moving on to any potential consequences or impacts in terms of housing delivery. So the bill, of course, sets out a structure for the primary legislation, and that structure is very similar to the primary legislation that we already have for SIL, but there are some noteworthy differences. And in short, the bill retains a high level of flexibility in terms of primary legislation, I suppose. Quite similar to SIL. If it ain't broke, if it ain't broke, then no need to fix it. As with SIL, though, the detailed construction of a levy is going to be set out in proposed regulations, and obviously we don't have those yet. You therefore need to look at the policy paper that was issued alongside the bill in order to get some sense, I suppose, of what that secondary legislation might look like. So a quick summary of some important points which you can elicit from both the bill and the policy paper together. It's going to be mandatory for all local authorities to charge IL. It's not optional, as it currently is with SIL. It's going to apply to changes of use, not just development of new or existing buildings, or it certainly can. And remember, the fact that SIL doesn't apply to changes of use, and the fact that it didn't and doesn't was an important and sort of vaunted part of its design originally. It's going to be based on rates set out in the charging schedule, like SIL, but those rates are going to be based on a percentage of the final gross development value of development, as opposed to this current SIL basis, which is a net increase in floor space. And there's going to be a minimum threshold under which it won't be charged. When will the levy be payable, however, and that's not yet entirely clear, and Simon, perhaps you can come back to this point in a minute. The intention seems to be that the levy will be calculated on the basis of the GDV at sale, or presumably at some other point if you're not selling, what happens there, BTR developments, for example, and so payable at that point. But the bill seems to allow for payments on account, so that seems to suggest that there may be an intention to allow for earlier payment with balancing payments perhaps at the end. What can it be applied to? Well, it can be collected and applied to infrastructure, very broad definition. We have that already, I suppose, but it's very clear that the intention is that it's going to be used for delivery of affordable housing, and that's probably one of the most significant differences. And alongside that, there's a proposed right to require, I think, developers to provide affordable housing on their sites in lieu of paying the cash levy, so an in-kind approach to life. Again, that's not new, it's in the SIL regs, so there is some experience in legislation to draw on there. And then finally, alongside that, what we've got is that Section 106 agreements are going to be scaled back significantly, and they're only going to be used for large and complex development. So I think it's binary, which is actually really helpful. Either you're Section 106 or you're levy, you're not both. Great. But obviously need to keep Section 106 agreements, or at least that's been recognised, because we need it for on-site infrastructure, again, where that has a broad meaning, obviously. So implications on housing delivery, well, that seems to me to be a very difficult question to answer on the basis of the detail that we've got at the moment. There are too many details that just aren't sufficiently clear, I suppose. Could it have a significant impact? Well, the answer is probably yes. But I think it's likely that we're going to find it difficult to disentangle the impact of the levy from all the various other things that are going on, whether it's taxes or new planning requirements or whatever, as we go through all these other changes. So I think in terms of the infrastructure levy, it's probably more helpful to focus on the sorts of things that perhaps will really matter in terms of fleshing out the actual sort of detailed structure of the framework under the regulations. And so just a few headline points. Rate setting going to be hugely important. Will we have a wider variety of rates? What's the minimum threshold going to be? How is all of this going to be set? How will the inevitably broad test of viability, which we already have under SIL actually, across an area how is that going to be applied, and so on? And how is the rate setting going to be affected by rolling affordable housing into what the levy can be applied to? Sorry, Simon, I know you've heard me say this multiple times already, but the stakes are really high if you roll affordable housing into the mix. Rate setting's now much more risky, it's much more important. Rates are going to have to be significantly higher. And there's going to have to be a lot of discussion over what the costs of providing affordable housing are in order to make all of this work. And similarly, if everything that would ordinarily, not everything, but a lot of things that would ordinarily be paid for by way of contribution under Section 106 agreements are also going to be swept into the levy pot, again, you're ratcheting up the risk even more. Calculation and timing of payment is another area, I think, which is also crucial, just touched on that. One thing that seems to be being implied about SIL is that it isn't particularly certain, when actually I think that's one of the things it does have going for it. We know that when it's going to be paid, we know the basis on which it's going to be calculated. I think the trick with IL is going to be ensuring that uncertainty as to the amount and when quantum and liability crystallizes for the purposes of the IL isn't increased or introduced in terms of fleshing out its detailed design, and how does it work with things like multi-phase development and the timing of calculation and payment of multi-phase development, and whether the level of liability can affect later phases and whether they're delivered at all. There are various other practical questions that need to be addressed, but I'm sure that will all come out in the wash. quick point about delivery of infrastructure. Research has shown that many authorities haven't been very good at spending SIL monies. So if they're collecting more for more things, again, surely there should be an increased emphasis on spending that money, on local authorities delivering with that funding. And you know, I personally would like to see something more on that. You know, in whatever form it comes forward. I'm not sure that the legislation so far in terms of producing infrastructure delivery plans, etc., really has much in the way of teeth and doesn't seem to have much impact in that sense. So to finish where I started in terms of conclusions, I don't think it's possible to say whether the ill will impact on housing delivery, because I think there isn't enough detail, but I do think the implications are much wider than that as an issue. I mean, even setting aside the fact that the ill will have the potential to affect all development, not just housing, it's all development. You know, the implications are broad in the sense that local authorities are going to be expected to fund more from the pot, including affordable housing. And if the rates aren't set in a sustainable way, then they could, broadly speaking, end up with less, not more, than they currently get. And there could be differential impacts on different types of development and different types of developer, which I think is the last thing perhaps that the government's intending. So just in the last few minutes then, Simon, perhaps you could come back on one or two of those questions.
Yeah, thank you, Meeta, and a fantastic overview of something quite complicated in very little time. Look, this is one of the bits of the bill which is genuinely new and quite big, replacing Section 106 and SIL, and I view it, Meeta, much less as replacing SIL, as replacing Section 106 and SIL for all but the largest developers, and that's the developments, and that's why I don't think there's the problem with affordable housing, because we manage that through Section 106 at the moment, and the revealed experiences, that's where most of the Section 106 goes to. You're right, there is a lot of detail, and we've promised a further consultation on that, and my guess is there'll be a series of these for us to work these things through. Just a couple of points though. I think you know, you asked the question about, is it payable at sale or given the provisions in the bill for advance payments. I think what we're envisaging has always been at sale, because that's the concept behind this. It's moves away from forward funding by the private sector. But what we may need is some of those advance funding payments for multi-phase developments, exactly as you describe. So that's a bit of what's in there. I think the issue is less the rates than the thresholds. I think setting the thresholds right per development, what is the build cost allowance, and then you know, once you've dealt with that, then the rates on top of it are much less impactful on viability. And one of the virtues of this, and why I'm a bit more optimistic on you on the homes, is that, you know, the key bit here is two things. One is removing the negotiation period that happens in a Section 106 into a more of a sort of, right, this is all fixed. It's set at the outset, and so you move that out from the process, and that enables you to bring forward the delivery of homes. The second bit is the setting the base of the tax on the GDV rather than a prescribed pound per floor space, which means that some of those increases in value and decreases as a result of market fluctuations are shared fairly between developers and communities, without the sort of haggle and renegotiation process that has to happen under the current system. So I think you've got a much more responsive model here. But look, Meeta, you've identified all the great questions that we need to do. What we have said is we will publish a further consultation. Again, you know, and there's a bit of a risk that this gets be a game of almost sort of like 20 questions of the government, in that we put out a consultation and people sort of say, but you haven't answered this question and you need to do this bit of detail. We evolve our policy thinking in stages and in waves, and it will get there in the end. You're helping us shape that. You're helping engaging us and saying, yeah, that bit works, that bit's not right. this bit you'll need to do slightly differently. That way you're going to be too complicated, you're worrying about the wrong thing. That is the sort of engagement we'll want, and we'll begin that process as soon as I can get a consultation paper out for everybody to have a look at.
Great, thanks, Simon. That was actually one of my general questions for the end, which was how are you sort of planning on going about consultation generally, I suppose, not just on the levy. Just one really quick question. I know we've got one eye on the time. I think we'll probably run over just by a few minutes if people can hang on for just a few minutes longer. Really quick question on the levy. Have you done any detailed work on crunching numbers on a GDV based approach to life?
Oh, watch this space.
Okay, great. Well, that was a quick response, which is what I wanted, really. I mean, just before we do sort of wrap up, just some timing considerations, really. There's so much in the bill, in the policy paper, in terms of what you need to bring forward. I have this notion that you have a really, really big office with a huge wall with a huge timetable written on it for all the different bits and pieces of legislation and policy that you have to bring forward, and that it must be one of the most complicated timetables ever. Do you have something like that? Are you able to give us some idea of timing in relation to perhaps some of the larger moving parts?
I'm afraid legislation processes are a bit similar to some of your large development schemes, where I'm sure you have a large timetable on the wall, but equally things move and things happen and things have the same degree of precision that that we have. So look, there are at least 3 degrees of how this works. The first top level is the bill. We have second reading scheduled for Wednesday. So anybody who wants to see planning debated in Parliament, it's due for Wednesday. Obviously, it's a Levelling-up and Regeneration Bill, so it will cover lots of things, but that will take place then. We're then expecting into committee, probably starting this side of the summer recess and probably carrying on into the autumn, then into the House of Lords. My guess is bills of this sort of size and scale take a good year to get through Parliament, so that's my rough rule of thumb, but that's sort of that's the process. And my lesson of doing umpteen bills is that what comes out of Parliament won't be exactly what's gone into it at the start. So, and there's obviously areas such as street votes where the government itself has promised that we will bring forward amendments to put those in further. So that's the first level, the primary legislation, and there's a process for that. The second is the secondary legislation. Obviously, we can't do that until the primary legislation is through. So we're working out, there's a couple of big bunches of regulations. There's a new set of plan making regulations that we will need. There's the new set of infrastructure levy regulations. There are the environmental outcomes reports, which we haven't really talked about, but which I think is potentially one of the other big parts of this, and those will need to come forward. But my guess is we're going to want good practices to consult on those. So my expectation is those sort of things will come out after the bill has been through, subject to our availability of legal resource to draft those things. Then the third tier is the policy development side of things. So we have talked about publishing a number of consultation papers. The first one has gone live today, as I mentioned earlier, on compulsory purchase and compensation and value, and I think that is genuinely, together with the measures in the bill, is something which could lead to more homes and more urban regeneration schemes coming forward. So it's really quite an interesting area. We know we have further consultations to do on the infrastructure levy, on environmental outcomes reports, on fees, charges, capability, capacity issues, which I think are really big issues, and a few others, frankly. There's some changes we're talking about on national infrastructure where I think we also want to come out, and people, we're just having a bit of a discussion about how we brigade those and how we sequence them through the system, but those will all start to come out. I would hopefully see certainly the majority of those this side of the summer, but there are a number of uncertainties as ever in dealing with things in government matters, but that's the sort of plan to help. I think they're going to be essential to help parliamentarians grapple with how we might use some of these powers of the bill, and I think there will, so I do want to sort of emphasise that dual level of interest, and that part of it is to help practitioners, but there's also helping parliamentarians understand as we go through the bill. And so those will then come forward into things. The other one, of course, is the National Planning Policy Framework Prospectus and what we're going to need to do. So where I envisage that going, but this is my magic whiteboard, is we'll publish something this spring which sets out some of these key questions which have been raised in here. It will inevitably not be their last word. We will then have to publish a new set of national development management policies and new national planning policy framework in draft after we've been through Parliament. That customarily we consult on those for lots of reasons, and then we'll bring those forward into force after then. One of the other things which I'm really keen that we get public out very soon is some of the transitional arrangements, particularly for local plan production. I'm really keen that we get that nailed down, agreed, and out there as soon as possible, so that those who are grappling with plan making at the moment know what way of the line to go for. Because I think one of the things where I suspect there might be a reasonable degree of consensus amongst the panel is that we want plan making under the current system to continue as far as possible, as soon as possible, right now. Meeta, that's a long answer, and I've gone over your timing, but hopefully that sort of answers some of it.
No, absolutely. No, that was a brilliant answer. Thank you very much. I wasn't quite expecting that much, to be honest. But no, absolutely brilliant. And yes, we are a little bit over time, but I think it's all been absolutely worth it. So many more questions, including just some, more general questions that, would love to have had time to ask you, Simon, including obviously the R question, which is resourcing. But I think we do need to leave it there, unfortunately. Hopefully, we might have you back on another webinar another day, Simon, as these things progress. So with an eye on the clock and the panel, this seems like a good place to wind up this webinar. So a huge thanks to Kathryn and Zack and Simon R, and of course an even huger thanks to you, Simon G, for taking the time to share your thoughts today, and also to give us some more information on how these things are going to start panning out and what we can expect to see over the rest of this year. Time definitely up. Thanks very much to everybody that's listening in. Lots more to come on the LURB over the coming months and years, but for the moment, it's time to sign off. Say goodbye and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in due course.
Thank you, Meeta.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.